On the morning of October 12, 1983, at precisely 6:47 a.m., the calm predictability of suburban Virginia shattered in a way no one in the Harper household or the United States intelligence community could have anticipated. As dawn settled over the quiet neighborhood, Anna Harper kissed her children goodbye, offered her husband a practiced smile, and told him she had an early meeting at work. There was nothing unusual about her tone, nothing in her expression to suggest that the next few minutes would mark the final moments of the life she had spent nearly a decade constructing. She walked out the door with only her purse and a single briefcase. She never returned. Her disappearance initially looked like a tragic but familiar mystery. A missing woman, a family left behind, and no obvious crime scene. But when her car surfaced 3 days later in a long-term parking lot at Dulles International Airport, keys still sitting in the ignition, the facade began to crack. And by the time investigators unraveled the first threads of inconsistencies, Anna Harper was already thousands of miles away, seated in a debriefing room in Moscow, sipping tea, speaking perfect Russian, and recounting 9 years of stolen secrets. Because Anna Harper never existed. Not the PTA volunteer, not the friendly neighbor, not the meticulous defense contractor employee. She was a ghost, an elaborate fabrication designed inside the machinery of Soviet intelligence, a weapon disguised as an ordinary American wife and mother. This is the story of her double life, the quiet theft of American military information, and the cold, unblinking calculations of a global conflict fought far from the battlefield. The story does not begin in Virginia. It begins outside Leningrad, in a secure training facility, where young recruits were molded into operatives capable of living entire lives under false identities. According to declassified KGB files, her real name was Yelena Mikhailovna Sokolova, born in 1947 in Minsk. Her upbringing was uneventful on the surface. Her father, a mid-level bureaucrat. Her mother, a schoolteacher. But the Soviet system had a way of identifying children who displayed traits useful to the state. Intelligence officers later described her as possessing the rare quality of intentional invisibility, a person who could glide through a crowd without attracting a flicker of attention. Instructors remembered her as unremarkable in the most valuable sense, a phrase that, in the world of espionage, was the highest form of praise. She adapted quickly, learning not only Western idioms and cultural references, but also the subtle emotional cues necessary to pass as someone who belonged. She mastered English with a softness that muted every hint of foreign origin. Her transformation was not theatrical. It was precise, behavioral, calibrated. She was not trained to impersonate an American. She was trained to become one. By 1973, the KGB crafted a new identity for her, Anna Koalik, a Polish student seeking opportunities in the United States. This backstory was not accidental. Poland produced a steady stream of immigrants to America, and the Cold War bureaucracy lacked the forensic capability to easily verify every foreign academic record. The forged passport, the university transcripts, even the narrative of fleeing a restrictive environment for a better life in the West. Every detail was engineered to blend seamlessly into U.S. immigration patterns. The KGB's long-term infiltration strategy was unlike Hollywood portrayals of espionage. These operatives were not sent to steal blueprints overnight. They were planted, expected to marinate inside Western institutions for years, becoming trustworthy before becoming dangerous. When Anna stepped off a plane in New York in 1974 with a student visa and a suitcase of deliberately American-looking clothes, She was one of many quiet infiltrators sent to seed the landscape of U.S. academia, industry, and government. Her first year in the U.S. unfolded without incident. She attended graduate classes at a modest university in New Jersey, studying electrical engineering, a field the Soviet Union desperately wanted insights into, given the West's lead in microelectronics and communications technology. She worked part-time in a library, the kind of job that left no trace and raised no eyebrows. She made acquaintances but kept her emotional distance, always slipping into the background, always observing. Then, in 1975, the long-term strategy clicked into place. She met David Harper, an engineer working for a mid-sized defense contractor with Defense Department connections. He was recently divorced, shy, and charmed by her understated personality. Their relationship, by all accounts, was genuine, at least for him. For Anna, the relationship represented deep cover gold, a stable domestic front, proximity to classified work, and the ultimate camouflage in American society. Marriage? They wed in April 1976. No guests from her side attended, a detail dismissed by David as a result of Polish travel restrictions. She became Anna Harper, an identity so fully Americanized that it provided her with social armor no forged document could replicate. For the Soviet Union, marriage was not simply a personal milestone. It was an operational triumph. American domesticity insulated spies better than any dead drop or coded message ever could. A married woman with children was, at that time, almost categorically dismissed as a counterintelligence threat. The KGB understood American assumptions better than America understood its vulnerabilities. By 1977, the Harpers moved to a quiet suburb outside Washington, D.C., and welcomed their first child, Emily. A second, Michael, followed 2 years later. Around this time, Anna secured a job at the same defense contractor where David worked, Advanced Systems Technologies. Her background check, based on her fabricated Polish identity, came back clean. The KGB had built a story airtight enough to withstand the relatively unsophisticated verification standards of the era. With that job came a security clearance, not the highest level, but enough to grant access to sensitive information about communication systems and military contracts. What seemed pedestrian to co-workers, project timelines, budget details, equipment specifications, was intelligence gold to Soviet analysts who excelled at assembling patterns from fragments. Anna began her work as a spy slowly, carefully. She memorized technical details, wrote coded summaries, and conveyed them during clandestine brush passes with an operative stationed at the Soviet embassy. No dramatic exchanges, no microfilm theatrics, just minutes-long encounters in crowded public places where two strangers briefly crossed paths and walked away, changed. For years, it worked flawlessly. Meanwhile, the Harper family lived the picture-perfect suburban life. School events, birthday parties, trips to the zoo, dinner conversations about office frustrations, and weekend plans. Neighbors described her as pleasant but quiet, someone who was always helpful but never intrusive. She balanced motherhood, career, and covert intelligence work with a discipline that astonished former KGB trainers who later examined her case. But the psychological strain of a double life is cumulative. Espionage is not merely deception, it's the erosion of self. To maintain her cover, Anna had to inhabit a character so completely that she became both the mask and the performer. Every word, every expression, every anecdote told to a neighbor had to align with a life that never existed. And while ideology may have sustained her in the beginning, the weight of betrayal, of her husband, her children, her fabricated community, was a burden she carried alone. By the early 1980s, the Cold War was shifting. Tensions sharpened. Technology advanced. Counterintelligence agencies grew more aggressive. And Anna's once stable position inside American society would soon begin to unravel. By the early 1980s, the global intelligence battlefield was changing faster than at any point since the Cuban Missile Crisis. The Soviet invasion of Afghanistan had triggered a geopolitical aftershock that rippled through every Western intelligence agency. In Washington, the election of Ronald Reagan accelerated a strategic shift: more defense spending, more counterintelligence initiatives, and a renewed focus on Soviet penetration of American institutions. The quiet equilibrium of the 1970s evaporated. The Cold War was hot again, not with missiles, but with information. Inside that shifting landscape, Anna Harper, who had operated quietly and efficiently for nearly a decade, suddenly faced new pressures. The KGB, tracking escalating tensions from Moscow, believed NATO was accelerating research on secure communication systems that could narrow the technological gap between East and West. They needed details, schematics, encryption concepts, timetables, and they needed them fast. In 1982, Anna received her most ambitious directive yet: obtain deeper intelligence on a communications encryption system being developed for NATO, a project of high strategic value, one that could potentially shield Western military communications from Soviet interception. This wasn't routine industrial data. This was priority material. To her handlers, Anna's position inside Advanced Systems Technologies made her one of the few long-term assets capable of accessing the information without raising immediate alarms. So she pushed deeper. She volunteered for late-night assignments. She requested additional responsibilities that put her closer to the project. And when the opportunity arose, she made copies, no longer relying solely on memorization or coded summaries, but using a miniature camera her handler had given her months earlier. To Soviet intelligence, this was the moment they had cultivated her for. To Anna, it was the most dangerous phase of her operation. And then, in the spring of 1983, the first domino fell. It started with something deceptively small: a misplaced document. A folder Anna had photocopied, but failed to return exactly as she found it. Under normal circumstances, the anomaly might have been ignored or chalked up to clerical oversight. But in an era of heightened paranoia, nothing was routine. A security officer noticed the discrepancy, flagged it, and triggered a deeper audit. This was the spark that ignited the chain reaction. As investigators reviewed access logs and cross-referenced timestamps, Anna's name surfaced repeatedly, not as an obvious suspect, but as a presence that was increasingly hard to ignore. Her access aligned a little too closely with irregularities. Her schedule, once unremarkable, now looked inconsistent under the microscope of counterintelligence standards. The FBI entered the picture discreetly. Behind the scenes, a veteran counterintelligence agent named Richard Callahan, a man who had spent decades chasing whispers of Soviet spies, began scrutinizing her background. And the more he dug, the more questions he found. The inconsistencies were small, but unsettling. A gap in her employment history, peculiarities in her immigration documents, the inability to verify certain academic records. In the early stages, these anomalies didn't prove espionage, but they made one thing clear. Anna Harper's life story had seams, and Callahan began pulling each one. By the summer of 1983, the FBI had opened a full investigation. Surveillance teams were assigned. Phone lines were tapped. Agents blended into her daily environment, quietly observing, quietly gathering. The Harper household remained unaware that the walls were closing in. Significantly, the FBI did not inform her husband, David, because they couldn't rule out the possibility that he was involved. In counterintelligence, assumption is a luxury that costs lives. Every person close to Anna was considered a potential accomplice until proven otherwise. Weeks passed. The surveillance produced nothing decisive. Anna continued living her suburban life with impeccable discipline. School events, carpools, office work, grocery runs. If she suspected anything, she showed no sign. And then came September 1983. On a Saturday afternoon, Anna told David she needed to run errands. Instead, she drove to Georgetown, parked near a shopping center, and spent nearly 40 minutes drifting through stores without buying anything. To casual observers, she looked like any other shopper. But to the FBI surveillance team trailing her, everything felt wrong. Her pacing, her seemingly aimless wandering, her subtle scanning of reflective surfaces. Then it happened. A brush pass. 10 seconds. 2 strangers passing within arm's reach. No conversation. No exchange of bags. No obvious contact. But Callahan's team recognized the man instantly, a Soviet intelligence officer under diplomatic cover. That fleeting moment was enough. The FBI intensified its operation immediately. More agents, tighter surveillance, expanded monitoring. The plan was to watch her long enough to capture indisputable evidence, then arrest her in a controlled sting operation that could unravel the entire network. But there was a factor even the FBI underestimated. Moscow was watching her just as closely. The KGB had its own early warning system, coded signals woven into newspaper ads, phrases embedded in seemingly mundane phone calls, small indicators known only to deeply embedded operatives. And in early October 1983, Anna received one of those signals. Its meaning was unmistakable. Her cover was blown. Leave immediately. Do not attempt to recover your life. Operatives in her position were conditioned to understand that such a signal meant only 2 things. The Americans were closing in, and staying meant death or extraction under interrogation. The KGB never intended for their deep cover agents to be captured alive. Secrets were currency, and captured spies became liabilities. On the morning of October 12th, Anna executed her exit plan with terrifying precision. She woke early. She made breakfast. She prepared her children's backpacks. She smiled at David, as if everything were normal. She delivered the line she had rehearsed in her mind for years, "I have an early meeting," and walked out with only the essentials. Inside her briefcase were $15,000 in cash, fake identity documents, and the bare minimum needed to erase herself from the American chapter of her life. She left behind her wedding ring, photographs, diaries, small mementos gathered from a decade of pretending to be someone she never was. She drove to Dulles, parked in long-term parking, left the keys behind, and vanished. Investigators later pieced together the most likely route. Dulles, Mexico City, Mexico City, Havana, Havana, Moscow. A route designed for deniability, far from the reach of U.S. jurisdiction. She likely switched identities mid-journey, shedding Anna Harper as easily as removing a coat. By the time the FBI realized she was gone, she was already being debriefed inside a secure Soviet facility. Calm, composed, answering questions in flawless Russian. Back in Virginia, the Harper family entered a nightmare without warning. David returned home expecting dinner, not disappearance. Hours became panic. Panic became police involvement. And within a day, the FBI knocked on his door, not with hope, but with truth. His wife had never existed. Neighbors recoiled in disbelief. Co-workers struggled to reconcile the friendly analyst with the KGB operative she truly was. And two young children, 6-year-old Emily and 4-year-old Michael, were left with a void where their mother had once been. As the investigation unfolded, David was cleared of involvement. He had been, in the FBI's words, an unwitting victim of one of the most sophisticated identity operations of the Cold War. But clearance did not bring comfort. Betrayal on this scale leaves a scar that feels permanent. And yet, the story was far from over. In the weeks following Anna Harper's disappearance, the FBI scrambled to reconstruct the operation she had been running beneath their noses. They followed paper trails, examined classified access logs, subpoenaed communication records, and conducted dozens of interviews. Neighbors, co-workers, friends, teachers at her children's school. What they found was not just evidence of espionage, but a portrait of an operative who had lived inside her double life so completely that no one, not even the people closest to her, had ever suspected a thing. Inside the walls of the FBI's counterintelligence division, the case sent shockwaves. America had weathered crises like the Walker spy ring, had confronted the threat of Soviet infiltration inside government laboratories and major contractors. But the Anna Harper case cut deeper. It wasn't simply about stolen documents. It was about proximity. The idea that a KGB officer had slept inside an American home, raised American children, moved through suburban life with absolute fluency, all while feeding valuable intelligence back to Moscow. For counterintelligence officials, this was a nightmare scenario, a deep cover agent who had not only blended into society, but had become society. The FBI's investigation into Anna's past accelerated. At first, they focused on the mechanical questions. How extensive was the damage? How much classified material had she accessed? Was she part of a wider network still operating on U.S. soil? But as weeks turned into months, the focus widened. Agents began tracing the origins of her forged identity, attempting to reconstruct the KGB pipeline that had inserted her into American life over a decade earlier. What they found confirmed their worst fears. Anna wasn't an anomaly. She was part of a broader Soviet strategy, one that involved long-term infiltration, patience measured in decades, and operatives raised from youth to abandon their own identities for the sake of the mission. Meanwhile, David Harper was living a private hell. FBI agents, in their methodical questioning, were forced to ask him the unthinkable. Did he ever suspect his wife was not who she claimed to be? Did she ever discuss politics, ideology, or foreign contacts? Did she ever behave unusually? Each question felt like an accusation, even though agents insisted he was not a suspect. David answered everything. He turned over bank records, phone logs, personal letters, anything the investigators needed. He wanted answers too, but none came quickly. His children, Emily and Michael, were too young to understand the geopolitical magnitude of what had happened. For them, the disappearance was not about the Cold War or espionage or KGB operations. It was about a mother who had kissed them goodbye one morning and never returned. And as the investigation deepened, the hardest truth remained. Anna had not attempted to contact them, not once, not even indirectly. As the FBI reconstructed her timeline, more troubling inconsistencies emerged. Her Polish passport contained forgery techniques that were years ahead of what most Western agencies believed the Soviets capable of. Her University of Warsaw transcripts, when examined closely, contained subtle printing anomalies and outdated academic seals, details that only specialists would notice. Even casual attempts to follow her supposed trail through Poland led to dead ends. Former classmates she claimed to know could not be located. Professors listed on her documents had retired, emigrated, or died long before investigators could track them down. It was as if Anna Kowalik had blinked into existence in 1974 and disappeared just as cleanly in 1983. By late 1983, the Soviet officer with whom Anna had been seen making the brush pass in Georgetown was expelled from the United States. It was a symbolic action. The FBI knew he'd returned to Moscow a hero, praised for his discipline and evasion. Espionage was a chessboard, and this move cost the Soviets nothing. Within weeks, the expelled diplomat was replaced by another operative under a new identity. The network remained intact. Damage assessments, conducted quietly within the Department of Defense, concluded that Anna had provided valuable but not catastrophic intelligence. Her reporting filled in gaps in Soviet knowledge, particularly in communications technology and procurement pipelines. The Soviets were masters at mosaic analysis, taking dozens of small pieces to form a larger strategic picture. Anna had been one of many contributing fragments. Her impact was real, but not decisive. Still, the symbolic damage was immense. Her escape exposed systemic vulnerabilities in the U.S. security clearance process, vulnerabilities that were immediately targeted for reform. For years, agencies had assumed that deep-cover Soviet operatives would be men working alone, not women embedded inside families, passing birthday cakes to neighbors while passing intelligence to handlers. Anna's case forced a re-evaluation of assumptions across the intelligence community. The Cold War was not simply a battle of machines and missiles. It was a battle of identities, fought in living rooms and grocery stores as much as in war rooms. Back in Moscow, Anna, or Yelena as she was known again, disappeared into the Soviet system. Western intelligence analysts believe she spent months in debriefings, recounting every detail of her years in America, what she learned, who she met, what vulnerabilities she observed in U.S. industry and culture. She would have been asked about everything: her marriage, her emotions, her fears, her operational decisions. To the KGB, nothing was irrelevant. Every fragment of her life in America had potential intelligence value. Where she went after those debriefings remains one of the lingering mysteries of the case. Some defectors who later fled the Soviet Union claimed she was reassigned under a new identity, possibly tasked with training younger operatives. Others said she suffered psychological breakdowns, unable to reconcile the life she built with the life she was forced to reclaim. A few suggested she lived quietly somewhere in the vast Soviet interior, an invisible figure who had once lived too visibly. None of these accounts were ever verified. What is known is what she left behind. In the months after her escape, David Harper struggled to maintain stability for his children. He moved them to a new state, away from news crews, away from neighbors who looked at him with pity or suspicion. He never remarried. Friends later said the betrayal hollowed him out, leaving him distrustful and withdrawn. A man who had once believed in love and partnership, now convinced that no one could ever truly be known. Emily and Michael grew up with only fragments of their mother. A photograph here, a memory there, a bedtime story preserved imperfectly in a child's recollection. They learned eventually the truth. But the truth offered no comfort. It only added weight to the absence, And yet, the broader story still wasn't finished. The American intelligence community began to recognize patterns that connected Anna's case to other operations on U.S. soil, other deep cover agents, other forged identities, other brush passes in shopping malls and parks. The Cold War, they realized, had never been a distant conflict. It had been happening right in front of them. In the quiet spaces of ordinary life. And Anna Harper, Yelena Sokolova, had been one of the most successful ghosts ever placed inside the American system. But the most haunting chapter of her story was still to come. As the Cold War shifted into its final decade, the case of Anna Harper, Yelena Mikhailovna Sokolova, continued to cast a long shadow over the American intelligence community. Though her disappearance had unfolded in a single October morning, its consequences stretched far beyond that moment. Investigators, policymakers, counterintelligence analysts, and even sociologists spent years attempting to understand what her story revealed about the vulnerabilities of open societies and the hidden architecture of ideological warfare. Inside the FBI, the Harper case became a teaching tool, a vivid illustration of how easily America's instinct to trust could be weaponized. For years, counterintelligence experts had assumed spies would reveal themselves through behavioral anomalies, unusual travel, unexplained finances, ideological extremism, or patterns of secrecy that deviated sharply from cultural norms. But Anna defied all expectations. She did not hide from society. She blended into it so deeply that suspicion became unthinkable. Her life was not constructed around shadows, but around fluorescent-lit offices, schoolyard picnics, and PTA meetings. She didn't operate from the outskirts. She operated from the center. This forced a reckoning. If someone like Anna could infiltrate an American suburb for nearly a decade, how many others had done the same? How many gaps in the system remained unguarded? And what did it mean for a society built on openness to confront an adversary built on secrecy? These questions echoed through agencies from the CIA to the Department of Defense. New systems were implemented, more rigorous background checks, deeper verification of foreign credentials, standardized cross-agency record reviews, and a growing emphasis on behavioral counterintelligence. But even with reforms, the fear remained. Could another Anna already be living behind a white picket fence somewhere in America? The case became a symbol of the psychological toll of espionage as well. Former intelligence officers often spoke publicly about the duality required of deep cover operatives, a constant performance, a life lived on shifting sand, where every relationship, every smile, every embrace, every bedtime story is part of a meticulously maintained illusion. Some operatives embraced the mission with ideological fervor. Others were shaped into obedience by cultural forces, family loyalty, or national indoctrination. Which category Anna belonged to remains an open question. Declassified fragments suggest she was chosen young for her adaptability and her ability to compartmentalize, a trait valued in espionage because it allows operatives to live contradictory lives without suffering immediate psychological collapse. And yet, even the most disciplined agents face internal fractures. Somewhere, beneath layers of fabrication and duty, the human self resists total erasure. What did Anna feel during those years in Virginia? Did she ever soften? Did she ever hesitate? Did she ever love the family she built, even if only as a shadow of her true identity? These questions haunted investigators, journalists, and scholars alike, but they also haunted the people she left behind. For David Harper, The aftermath of her disappearance was a slow descent into emotional isolation. Reports from those who knew him later describe a man who struggled not only with betrayal, but with the existential question of whether the life he lived had ever been real. Every memory, his wedding day, the birth of his children, shared holidays and whispered conversations, became suspect in retrospect. He lived with the knowledge that the person he loved had been designed to deceive him, that his home had been a stage set, that his marriage had been a mission. David spent years in therapy attempting to rebuild his identity, but friends say the wound never fully healed. He died in 2019, having never remarried, carrying to the grave the weight of a life overturned by a conflict he never participated in. For Emily and Michael, the psychological impact took a different shape. Emily, old enough to remember flashes of her mother, her voice, her gestures, the feeling of her presence, grappled with a mix of confusion, grief, and resentment that followed her into adulthood. Michael, too young to recall much of anything, grew up with an absence rather than a memory, a void filled in by other people's explanations of why his mother chose to leave. Neither child ever heard from her again. Not a letter, not a coded message, not a whispered signal through intermediaries. Nothing. Whether this was because she was forbidden to contact them or because she chose not to, is one of the many unanswered questions that cement the Harper case as one of the Cold War's most haunting personal tragedies. On the geopolitical stage, the case represented a small but telling part of a much larger mosaic. Dozens, perhaps hundreds, of Soviet deep-cover operatives were placed in Western nations during the Cold War. Some were detected early. Some were quietly exchanged in spy swaps. Some lived uneventful lives, waiting for orders that never came. And many more were never discovered at all, living and dying behind masks that Western intelligence services never pierced. What made Anna's case stand out was the level of immersion. She did not simply operate within the United States. She became embedded in its social fabric. Her cover was not a costume, but a life. Yet even with the enormity of her deception, intelligence analysts concluded that the information she delivered, while useful, did not alter the Cold War's strategic balance. Her role was one thread in a web of Soviet espionage efforts, important but not pivotal. She was a disciplined operative, but not among the most influential spies of her era. Still, the most haunting dimension of her story is not what she stole, but what she'd surrendered. By the time she fled to the Soviet Union, Yelena had already sacrificed her own identity. But on that October morning, she sacrificed something even deeper: the life she had built, the family she had raised, and the children she left, crying at the threshold of a door she would never walk through again. Where she ended up remains unknown. If she is alive today, she would be in her late 70s, a woman living under yet another name in another quiet neighborhood, perhaps walking to buy bread each morning like anyone else. She may have grandchildren. She may live alone. She may have spent decades haunted by the faces of the children she abandoned, or she may have severed all emotional ties long ago, as fully trained operatives were conditioned to do. Former KGB defectors, who later spoke about her, offered contradictory versions. Some said she was revered as a model operative. Some said she faded into bureaucratic irrelevance. Some said she became a cautionary tale about the cost of a single operational mistake. None of these accounts can be verified. And so her story remains suspended in ambiguity, an unresolved chapter in a conflict defined by secrets, silence, and shadows. In the end, the tale of Anna Harper, Yelena Sokolova, is not a story with heroes or villains in the traditional sense. It is a story about the collision of ideology and identity, about the human cost of geopolitical struggle, and about the ways the Cold War infiltrated the most intimate corners of ordinary life. It is about the fragility of trust, the malleability of truth, and the impossibility of ever fully understanding the motivations that drive someone to betray everything they appear to cherish. On that Friday morning in October 1983, a woman walked out of her home and vanished into history. The ripple effects of that decision continue to echo through intelligence archives, through the fractured lives of the people she loved, and through the unanswered questions that still linger in the margins of a war fought in silence. Her case remains technically open, but every practical avenue for answers has long since closed. What remains is the story, a story of deception, sacrifice, and consequences that neither nation, nor family, nor history can fully reconcile.